What do your grades look like? Do the grades that your students earn reflect their mastery and what they can do with and in the target language? In this episode, I speak with Jude Krushnowski, the director of the World Language Teacher Education Program at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. He walks us through a framework for competency-based grading in our proficiency-based classrooms. Lots of tips, insights, and suggestions for making this transition to assessments authentically reflecting our students' competency. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral. I just have to say that you're an incredible teacher for, taking the time out of your week to listen to a podcast about language teaching. So thank you so much for doing that. So today's topic is going to be about standards-based grading, and we're going to be talking about doing that within proficiency-based instruction in our classroom. So this is a topic that a lot of us are talking about right now, this whole idea of grading. What does grading look like? So to help us dive into this whole conversation today, we are going to be talking with Jude Krushnowski. And Jude recently wrote a chapter in Honing Our Craft, which was a publication from CLET World Languages. It was edited by Florencia Henshaw and Kim Patowski. And he actually wrote chapter 7 in that book, which is standards-based grading and proficiency-based instruction. So I wanted to bring him on so that I could actually get the answers to all the questions that I have about it, assuming that a lot of you have those same questions. Jude is the director of the World Language Teacher Education Program at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and he has a background in teaching Spanish and ESL, but as the director of this program, he is working with teachers to get their state licensure in teaching various languages, and he also has all the classes on methodology to help guide those teachers. And as I said, he is a writer within the world of language instruction. He wrote this chapter in Honing Our Craft, chapter 7, which I highly recommend this book. It's very useful. But he's also out there in the conference scene working with teachers, working at the CLET conferences, as well as at ACTFL and at ICTFL. Shout out to another state language association. You know I love them. So Jude Krushnowski, thank you so much for being with us today on the World Language Classroom Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add into kind of who you are, what you're doing out there with language teachers?
I would like to plug one project that I'm working on with some colleagues from Cornell, Emilia Maikes and Alan Vanden Arend. I'm working with both of them to develop a YouTube channel called TBLT, not to be confused with T with BVP, but it's the same idea of tea. So we're spilling the tea on task-based language teaching, and we will be uploading videos from experts in the field on different aspects of TBLT and how to implement it in the classroom. So we will be launching that in the next month or so stay tuned for that.
That sounds really exciting. So speaking of exciting things, are we ready to talk about standards-based grading?
Absolutely. Let's do it.
I like to always start with just sort of an explanation of what are we even talking about when we say standards-based grading. So how is that different, or is it very different from what we see as a traditional or more legacy approach to grading?
Well, first off, I want to not clarify, but just maybe update some folks on the terminology. So standards-based grading was the kind of the nomenclature that was in vogue when I wrote the chapter. However, since then, there's been a shift towards competency-based grading or mastery-based grading, but these all mean the same thing. And what that means is that we are focusing on what students are learning and what students can do when we are planning our lessons and when we are assigning our grades. And so we are grading and developing assessments with what students are able to do specifically when we design our teaching and our grading.
What would be your lens on what traditional grading was assessing that's different than what you just described as a mastery-based approach?
So traditional grading typically includes things like attendance or completion or participation, or you might see a traditional exam that perhaps gives students a grade for everything, speaking, listening, reading, and writing all together. And so when a person, a parent, a student, an administrator looks at the grade, they're not quite sure exactly where the student is demonstrating mastery and what this grade represents. We might see a grade like a 90% or a 70%, but 90% of what? 70% of what? And so the grade does not give us a clear idea of what it is that the student can do and where it is that they're showing mastery. The things that go into traditional grading are a measure of compliance. And sometimes it's good, maybe, and this might, if teachers are perhaps not familiar with standards-based grading or this, how it differs from traditional grading and this element of compliance, I would recommend, to the extent that it's possible, to go back into the gradebook and to remove things that measure compliance and see how grades change. See what grades look like when you take that out. And a lot of times they have an inflationary effect. And so we feel pretty good, or a detrimental effect, depending on the student and their circumstances. And so if we just simply take that out, we might see that perhaps the student that, it looks like is in risk of failing the class is actually doing pretty well on the content. They're maybe losing some points because, I'm not sure, maybe attendance is suffering or participation. But when it comes to the exams, they're actually doing well. Or we might see a reverse effect where a student is, in terms of mastery, not doing that well, but their grade is inflated because of these things like compliance. So just to kind of help get a sense for what that could look like and how that can affect your gradebook right now, sometimes it's helpful to go back and just take out those grades and see what it would look like.
Right. And within that whole idea of compliance, we could possibly be going about that grading with a bias, right? It's our impression, idea of expectation of the way things should be being done, but it's not actually the mastery. So that was one of my big takeaways from that part was, wow, I'm actually removing my biases from how I'm grading when I'm just looking at what they're able to do, because that compliance piece really brings in to question the DEI-JB work and the SEL work and all of that that's within there. So how did you sort of fall on this as being an area of focus for you? Like, what was that situation where you said, okay, we need to look at this in a different way?
I think that there's a number of things, or there's kind of two things I think that came together quite beautifully, right? There is the push towards proficiency-based or acquisition-driven instruction, proficiency-based instruction. Again, we have a number of terms to refer to essentially the same thing, that is teaching students to be effective communicators of the language, right? Teaching students to communicate with the language as opposed to teaching about the language. And so I think that was the first piece. And then also I found myself in a middle school at the time that was embracing standards-based grading. And I noticed that there was a certain confluence between this proficiency-based instruction in the kind of world language scene, and then also this more global standards-based grading movement that was affecting all content areas in the school that I was in. And they worked together very well. And so to me, it was one of those aha moments where sometimes we see initiatives in education that you're doing one thing as a teacher and then something new comes along and it's hard to square the two. But in this case, they worked together and dovetailed quite well, and it just made sense. And so it really helped me then to decide to advocate for this, implement it in my own classes, and really see the benefits.
I'm appreciating the shift away a little bit from the word standards into looking at mastery or looking at competency-based grading, because I think when teachers hear the word standards, they're thinking, but which standards? Are these my state standards? Are these our departmental standards? Are these national ACTFL standards? So as teachers are looking at teaching toward this idea, I'm going to say standards, but competency. So when we grade with a more, I call it legacy approach, those traditional approaches, like we know it's AR verbs. They can conjugate AR verbs. I can easily tag that and say they can do that. I can say they know how to write the different forms of demonstrative adjectives. I can very much pinpoint what that is. So when we're looking at grading for competency or standards, what does that look like in terms of what I'm actually assessing?
And I do appreciate and I wholly endorse the move towards a mastery or competency-based approach, that title, as opposed to standards-based, because there can be some confusion. I've actually seen some well-meaning authors kind of conflate standards-based grading with standardized testing and say that it's not, that standards-based grading therefore is not very equitable. And I would say actually it's a more equitable approach because it removes the biases that we kind of mentioned earlier. But now back to your question about what are we assessing and what does that look like, right? You can assess, AR verbs, right? And how can students fill in a verb paradigm, a verb chart? But at the end of the day, that is, if we look at Bloom's taxonomy, that is very lower level memorization, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, of course, cognitively, it's memorization. Communicatively, it's there's not much there, right? You're not doing much communicating by filling in a verb chart. And so when we look at the standards standards, when we look at the targets, perhaps we could say growth targets that we're looking for in mastery-based learning, competency-based learning, those are derived from the proficiency guidelines from ACTFL, the can-do statements from ACTFL, and they're tied to specific communicative outcomes that we would like to see for our students, right? Are students able to introduce themselves and give their name, age, and birthday, for example, right? Are students able to listen to a story and identify the names of the characters and the important events in a story? Right. These are things then that we can set as targets for our students. They target using the language for communication, right? Productively or receptively, and go well beyond simply memorizing verb paradigms or different discrete elements of grammar.
When teachers are looking to do something different in their classroom or to enhance their teaching in some way, particularly teachers who have been teaching for 15 or 20 years, this could be a pretty dramatic shift in their approach. And is there a place for, I'm going to call it a both and transition time, where you mentioned, you could do that quiz on the AR verb forms, but then what is what you referred to as the communicative outcome? So is there a place in this transition time for a both and, or would you recommend that teachers go right into the communicative outcomes, or just talk us through that transition period for teachers that are listening?
There certainly is a both and element to this. If teachers are in a situation where they're just doing grammar and there is no focus on communication, that learning curve will be steep, right? On the other end, though, I would not advocate for a completely grammar-free model either. And this comes down to our rubrics, right? And so when we talk about our rubrics and the different criteria that we're using to grade production, so written work or spoken work, that rubric typically contains something in the way of language control. Right? Because language control can affect how well people understand us, right? If we're not using certain grammatical forms correctly or well, then we're not able to express what it is that we want to say, or our interlocutor will not understand us. And so we can incorporate things like pop-up grammar in the classroom, perhaps some quizzes or some kind of an exit slip or something like that. I wouldn't put a major focus on grammar. Of course, we want to get away from discrete grammar focus, but it has its role, right? It has its role because when we communicate, inevitably we use grammar. And that's the nature of language acquisition, is making form-meaning connections. And we can't have one without the other. We can't assign meaning if there's no form. And so we need to target the forms that are important when we're communicating without making them the sole focus of our teaching.
Thank you for making that clarification. I think that teachers need to hear people in authority, and I'm going to call you an authority on this. You're writing about it. We're talking about it here on a podcast. So it's sort of allowing teachers to just take a deep breath and then to just exhale. There's so much do this, don't do that. It's black and white, one or the other. This is the right way, that's the wrong way. And I don't like to see those divides. We just don't need these divides in our language teaching world or in other places. And one of those great divides is grammar. So thank you for giving us an opportunity to exhale a little bit and sort of say, okay, there's a place for it, but it's about not the slippery slope of, oh, it just means I can do grammar all the time. So the way you put it is that, you are going to start with it, but then you want to move towards that communicative outcome with it, which is so important. We talked a little bit about what we are assessing and what we're not, but can we go back to that real quickly in terms of what our grade books might look like? Because as much as we want to embrace this, most of us work within a school system where there are certain expectations. Hopefully we're in a department that allows for communicative language teaching. That's not always the case. I talk to teachers all the time that have a very grammar, vocabulary focused curriculum. But if we are moving towards a communicative classroom and grading as such, what would you recommend that our grading categories and grade book look like?
There is no perfect way to teach, and there is no perfect amount of grammar. Of course, we want to focus on communication. And when we talk about assessment, we often talk about backwards design. It's one of the ACTful core practices. We want to backwards design with the end in mind when we design everything from assessments to our classroom strategies. And so as teachers, I think the first step is just to have that end goal being communication in mind. What do we want students to do when they leave our classroom? Do we want them to be masters of conjugating verbs or masters of actually, perhaps not masters because it's hard to get to an advanced proficiency in just the classroom, but do we want them to be on their way to a higher proficiency level when it comes to communicating? And I think most teachers would agree. That's what we want them to do. We want them to be able to communicate with people out in the real world, right? And so if we just have that as our goal as teachers, I think that helps us at least adjust what our approach is. And there's not going to be a perfect way to get there, but it at least lets us align our practice and our assessment with that eventual goal, right? Now, in terms of the categories for the gradebook, everyone's gradebook will look different depending on school district. Even from school to school within district, gradebook categories might look a little bit different. Now, standards-based, competency-based, mastery-based grading, schools that have fully embraced it have a gradebook that does not assign one single grade. Students have a grade per mastery area or per standard. So for example, for presentational speaking, students might have one grade, and then for interpretive listening, students might have a different grade. And then a student would receive that whole list of grades per mastery area when they see their score report. For schools that maybe have one unifying grade, it looks a little bit different. And the mastery areas could be similar. So we might have a mastery area that is something like presentational speaking, presentational writing, interpersonal speaking, interpersonal writing, interpretive listening, interpretive reading. Personally, I recommend using those 6 categories because it does allow us, even if at the end of the day we average them into one unifying grade, it still allows students to see the areas that are bringing down their overall average. Mm-hmm. And so I would recommend using that. Some, perhaps folks who don't follow ACTful as much might use the 4, so speaking, reading, listening, and writing. Also another way to break things down. It's not as specific, right, because it doesn't take the audience into account and the type of communication that is happening, but it is another way, though, to break the skills down into 4 categories in the gradebook. But what's important, though, to notice is that there is no category for participation, for attendance, right, for homework. Those things are not individual categories, right? We're focusing on grading their ability to speak, right, or to write, or to listen, or to read.
You mentioned homework and participation. This is another one of those big questions that comes up from teachers all the time. What is the place of homework in a proficiency-based program in terms of how you're grading and giving a grade? Where does it go, and do you even give it?
So you can give homework, and I think there's nothing wrong with giving homework. The issue with grading homework becomes we don't know what homework represents, right? If students are able to do it with Google Translate, we don't know if they are demonstrating any communicative ability or if they just put it in Google. Well, now ChatGPT, which is a whole other can of worms, but we don't know if or they might have an older sibling or parent who's helping them too. But we don't know who is helping them, right, with that homework, if anyone. And so if we are giving it a mastery grade, well, that mastery grade might not be reflective of what they can actually do. And so if we're telling students you got an excellent on this assignment, and they get an excellent on all of their homework assignments, but then on the actual summative assessment, they don't get an excellent, well, then there's a mismatch, right? It's confusing to explain that later on to administrators or parents where, well, they did everything they should on the homework, but on the exam, it didn't go so well. But then also, if we don't assign a mastery assessment of homework and we just measure it for completion, then again, that can have either a detrimental or an inflationary effect on the grade. We don't know how well students are able to communicate. We just know they did the homework, maybe well, maybe not well, but they put answers on it. Or maybe they didn't submit it, but we don't know why they didn't submit it either. Are there things going on at home? Is a student working another job to support their family? Are there different equity pieces that go into the homework? When we're putting it into our grades, it can have this unintended consequence of perhaps benefiting students who are able to dedicate time to homework, or benefiting students, but we don't really know what their mastery level is. So it makes our interpretation of the grade less clear. We're not sure what students are able to do. And also, right, can have a detrimental effect where it brings down grades for students that, for one reason or another, are simply unable to do homework. Again, not to say that reinforcing learning outside of the classroom is a bad thing. It's a good thing. We want to do that as much as possible. And we want to provide students with opportunities to use the language outside of the classroom. It's just how that comes back into our grading that is what we need to re-examine and reevaluate.
Yeah, we had to look at the idea of homework really closely within our department as we transitioned to this. And what we ended up doing is we made it a part of our reassessment policy for retakes.
And that is certainly one thing that I recommend in my chapter about how teachers can incorporate homework, right? They can use it as part of their retake or their reassessment policy. And something similar can be done with attendance as well, whereas attendance needs to meet a certain threshold for students to be able to retake an assessment, or perhaps there's some combination where students miss X number of classes, then they must take complete Y number of homework assignments to be able to do the reassessment, right? So perhaps we're not assigning a grade to that homework, but we are keeping them accountable for it in the event they do want to do a reassessment at some point. And also, I would just add, as we're talking about grade books, it's not breaking any law or anything to add a formative or a homework piece to your grade book if you do need to assign grades for homework. So that's one way of going about homework. Another way is to target your homework so that it does target some standard or some competency or mastery area. So it can be listening, it can be speaking, or something along those lines, but then make the value lower, right? So that it's not contributing as much to the overall grade for that standard area. So just to give some, again, there's no one way. And I know sometimes we like to hear, do it this way. And there is no clear do it this way, right? But there are plenty of options because our context changed, our students changed. We need to be able to adapt our teaching so that our students benefit the most. And so we just have to see what options are out there and how we can make this potentially new system of grading and teaching work with our current and existing system.
Yeah, it's always this transition time. We have these more old school, I call them legacy approaches, and then we try to retrofit those into our new ones. And so that's kind of always the challenging part when we're doing something new. And so it has to be a both and for a little bit and figure out what works within your own department and your own school. Are there any recommendations that you could give to our listeners in terms of reading more about this? I definitely recommend that they pick up Honing Our Craft because your chapter is, I think, pretty groundbreaking because it's so awesome. I particularly like the part at the end with your list of do this, don't do that. If you have nothing more than that, then you would just have everything you need. But besides looking to Honing Our Craft in your chapter in here, is there anything else you could recommend to our listeners?
I would recommend a few things. The work of Thomas Guskey has been very instrumental in sort of my approach to SBG. So he is based out of the University of Kentucky. And so he's doing great work. And then Susan Brookhart, also out of Duquesne, is very mastery-based, competency-based doing a lot of work in that field with focus on assessment. So again, they are not working from a world language perspective, but from a general ed, all content areas perspective. And I think they offer a lot of just good content and very accessible content on how to get started, right, with the transition. And they do focus on that initial start, right? How do I make the change? How do I get started? And then, of course, I would plug Common Ground. I think it's not new, right? It shouldn't be new to most people, but I would plug it if it is new to someone. Common Ground, Second Language Acquisition Theory Goes to the Classroom by Florencia Henshaw. And Maris Hawkins is a wonderful book as well that I would recommend for sure. I'm currently reading Representation, Inclusion, and Social Justice in World Language Teaching. It's a edited volume by Lily Padilla and Ross Divana, which is a wonderful volume as well that folks should check out. Culture responsive teaching, again, CRT principles are something that we should be looking at as we look at teaching a world language, right? World languages. I think we are ambassadors to in one way or another of culture or cultures of the language or of the communities that speak the languages that we teach. And I would recommend that text as well.
I had Florencia Henshaw and Maris Hawkins on 2 years ago when Common Ground first came out. So I'll make sure those are in the show notes so that if people want to hear directly from Florencia and Maris, I will have those links in the show notes so you can hear our conversation with that. So Jude, if our listeners want to be in touch with you, to collaborate, find out more about this, how can we be connecting with you?
Well, they can reach out on Twitter. My handle is at ProfeCrush, so it's ProfeKrush. And so I'm very accessible on Twitter /X, whichever nomenclature you prefer. Also, I'm open to emails at jcrush2, so that's JKRUSH2 at illinois.edu. So either of those avenues is good for connecting with me.
Excellent. Wonderful. And I always like to leave our listeners with a hearty piece of advice as we end our conversation. So what can you leave with us?
Well, I think that being patient, I would just say be patient. Be patient and extend a little bit of grace to yourselves, to your students, to those around you. But be patient because we, I think, live in a world that wants next day shipping. We want to binge every episode of the series that same day. We don't want to wait for commercials. We want that email to come back to us on the weekend. And so be patient with your students, be patient with yourself, but learning doesn't happen instantaneously and language acquisition doesn't happen instantaneously. And teaching a language is unlike any other subject. And so language acquisition is a slow, piecemeal process. And so we need to take the small wins. When we see them, we need to keep an eye out for those small developments, right? Are students able to say a little bit more? Are they able to form sentences that are a little bit longer? Are they able to understand us a little bit more when we're speaking? So just be more patient, right, with what our students are able to do, because it's not going to be, from one day to the next, students are instantly advanced speakers of the language. It's a very piecemeal process. And if we don't highlight those small wins, sometimes we get in our heads and we might be a little bit disappointed or we might become discouraged. And we need our teachers to be, like you started the show with, teachers are awesome. And so we just need our teachers to be able to recognize those little moments of awesome that they are causing throughout their time teaching.
Thank you so much for giving those insights about the next day shipping and the series binging. I'd never thought of it that way and how much that influenced our expectation for our students and our teaching. So that was mind-blowing for me. So thank you for bringing that up right there at the end. So thank you for all of your insights, for just introducing this topic through your writing so that we have something to guide us and to look to, and for being here and having an open and honest conversation and realistic conversation with us today. I very much appreciated that and all of your time.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for this podcast and for all you do. I appreciate it.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Jude Krushnowski? This whole idea of updating how we grade is a process for sure. And as Jude pointed out, we need to be patient through this transition. Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Jude Krushnowski. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together. We can do that either in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.